Hi there, this is Emily Mielstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video to gather comments on Refish Amendment 46, which considers the gray triggerfish rebuilding plan. The gray triggerfish stock is overfished. In fact, in 2012, the Council modified a rebuilding plan that we already had in place through Amendment 37 and aimed to rebuild the stock in 5 years or less. So that would have been by this year. In 2005, however, a stock assessment determined that the population is not making adequate progress towards rebuilding. The Council must prepare and implement a plan to rebuild the stock by considering making modifications to the rebuilding time period, catch levels, recreational management measures, and also commercial management measures. We'll start with Action 1, which looks at establishing a rebuilding time period for gray triggerfish. So Amendment 37, which aimed to rebuild the stock by 2017, is not making adequate progress. The Magnuson-Stevens Act requires that a new rebuilding plan be put in place within 2 years of notification. So that notification was received by us once we got the stock assessment in 2015 that indicated that adequate progress towards rebuilding was not being made. The Magnuson-Stevens Act also requires that rebuilding is as short as possible while taking into account the biology of the fish and the needs of the community fishing for that fish. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative, and that would not establish a new rebuilding timeline for gray triggerfish. This alternative would not meet the requirements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Alternative 2 would allow rebuilding in the shortest time period of 6 years by establishing a fishing mortality of 0 starting in 2017. Alternative 3 would establish an 8-year rebuilding timeline, and the stock would be expected to be rebuilt by 2024. Alternative 4, which is the Council's current preferred alternative, would establish a rebuilding time period of 9 years, or by 2025. And then Alternative 5 would establish a rebuilding time period of 10 years, or by 2026. Action 2 considers establishing catch levels to correspond with our rebuilding timeline. The current annual catch limits and annual catch targets for gray triggerfish were set through Amendment 37. The stock is allocated so that 21% is commercial and 79% is recreational. The Council's scientific advisors have recommended 3 new yield streams that correspond with rebuilding timelines. Alternative 1 is the no action alternative, and that would retain the annual catch limits and targets set in Amendment 37. Alternative 2 would set the annual catch limits and targets for gray triggerfish at 0 pounds. And then Alternative 3 considers using a constant catch annual catch target based on the acceptable biological catch yield stream suggested by the Council's scientific advisors. This would also use the annual catch limit and annual catch target control rule and landings from 2012 through 2015. This is an 8% buffer in the commercial fishery and a 20% buffer in the recreational fishery. We could select one of 3 options here, and option A would rebuild in 8 years, option B would rebuild in 9 years, and option C would rebuild in 10 years. This table would show the corresponding annual catch limits and annual catch targets for each alternative being preferred. You'll see highlighted in blue the Council's current preferred is to retain the current annual catch limits and targets that were established through Amendment 37. Action 3 considers modifying recreational management measures. Currently, the recreational sector is allocated 79% of the gray triggerfish stock annual catch limit. Since the implementation of Amendment 37 in 2013, the recreational sector has exceeded its annual catch limits and its annual catch targets on numerous occasions. The recreational sector is also subject to an in-season closure, which allows the regional administrator to close the fishery when the annual catch target is expected to be met. And they're also subject to a payback provision. So, If an annual catch limit is exceeded, the following year's annual catch target can be reduced by the amount of the overage. You've probably noticed that this year the recreational sector is closed completely for gray triggerfish fishing. The accountability measures that I just mentioned resulted in a post-season overage adjustment by the amount of the overage from the previous year. So by the amount of the overage from the 2016 fishing year. The adjusted annual catch target was 177,000 pounds whole weight. And then the 2016 recreational landings for that year were 433,000 pounds, exceeding the annual catch target by 239%. So there is no fishing season because we had to deduct that overage from this year's fishing season, which doesn't allow us to open the fishery at all. So the council would like to attempt to find a way to meet recreational fishing needs while reducing the harvest of gray triggerfish in the future. Currently, we have a closed season for gray triggerfish from June 1 through July 31. And we have a 2 fish bag limit within that 20 reef fish aggregate. The council is considering modifying the fixed close season, the bag limit, and the minimum size limit for recreational gray triggerfish fishing. Okay, so we'll start with modifying the recreational fixed close season. As I mentioned, that season that is closed is from June 1 to July 31. The closure was created in Amendment 37 to slow the rate of harvest and to protect the spawning of gray triggerfish. We have a few alternatives here. We could choose to retain the current June 1 through July 31st closure, or we could modify that closure by extending it so that it closes June 1 and extends through August 31st. That's alternative 2. Alternative 3 would close the season from January 1 all the way through July 31. Alternative 4, which is the council's current preferred alternative, would close the season on January 1 through the end of February, and then retain that current closure, which is June 1 through July 31. And then alternative 5 would close gray triggerfish season recreationally from January 1 through January 31, and then retain the current closure of June 1 through June 31. Next, the council is looking at modifying the recreational bag limit. Reducing the bag limit for gray triggerfish is expected to reduce the rate of harvest and thereby allow more fishing days for gray triggerfish. Less than 10% of trips that land reef fish land their 2 gray triggerfish per person bag limit. So reducing that bag limit would reduce landings without impacting a majority of fishing trips. Our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would retain the 2 gray triggerfish bag limit. Our second alternative is the council's current preferred alternative, and that would reduce the bag limit to 1 gray triggerfish per person. And the last recreational management modification that's being considered is the minimum size limit. So when the council considers setting an effective minimum size limit, they usually take into account the size and age at reproductive maturity and the discard mortality of the fish. Triggerfish are reproductively mature at 10 inches fork length, and they also have a very low discard mortality in comparison to other reef fish. So increasing the minimum size limit allows fish to mature and more spawning opportunities to happen before harvest, and it is not expected to significantly increase dead discards. The first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would retain our current 14-inch fork length minimum size limit. The second alternative is the council's current preferred alternative, and that would increase the minimum size limit to 15 inches fork length. And then alternative 3 would be to increase the gray triggerfish minimum size limit to 16 inches fork length. You can see on this table the estimated time it takes for a triggerfish to grow from 14 inches to 16 inches. So when we combine all of those preferred alternatives, catches are projected to be 201,000 pounds. And that is within the current preferred annual catch target of 217,000 pounds. So we would be meeting our goals if we made the current preferred alternatives our final decisions. Finally, we move on to consideration of modifying the commercial trip limit. So since the 12 fish commercial trip limit was put into place through Amendment 37, commercial landings have been below their annual catch target. Increasing the commercial trip limit would provide a better opportunity for that commercial sector to achieve their quota. This graph shows the percent of commercial trips landing different numbers of gray triggerfish in the Gulf from two different time periods. Our first alternative would maintain the current 12 fish trip limit. The second alternative would decrease the trip limit to 10 fish. The third alternative would increase the commercial trip limit to 14 fish. The current preferred alternative is alternative 4, and that would increase the commercial trip limit to 16 fish. And then the council could also consider alternative 5, which would increase the commercial trip limit to 18 fish. The council expects to take final action on this amendment in April. You can read the full document. You can submit your comments to us by March 28th by following this link. Alternatively, you can go to our homepage at www.gulfcouncil.org and click on the thermometer icon, and you can scroll down and find the Triggerfish amendment. Or you can contact us at gulfcouncil@gulfcouncil.org with any comments or questions that you have. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and send us your comments so we know what you would like us to do on this gray triggerfish amendment.